Tel Aviv. Trevor, welcome to GB News. To you, what does this latest development in the Gary Lineker saga tell you about the BBC?
Well, I think Gary Lineker exemplifies two particular problems that the BBC has. One is its essential abandonment, gradual erosion of its commitment to impartiality. And secondly is the weakness of its government, of its governing bodies, its chairman and its director general, to control the BBC itself. If I can explain that briefly, the BBC owes its reputation very substantially to the fact that it claims to provide accurate and impartial news. And as shoring up that reputation for impartiality, the influential and important people in the BBC have been subjected to social media guidelines, which effectively prevent them from breaking that rule on impartiality. So in particular, people who are not news journalists are expected to not to state biased views on particularly controversial issues. Gary Lineker clearly breached that rule. Now, you would think that an organisation like the BBC, given the importance of impartiality, it would come down on him and enforce the rules. What the BBC did, because they were so desperate to hang on to Gary Lineker as part of their programming, is they changed the rules and loosened them. And that, I think, is what brings me to the second point, is we've got the tail wagging the dog here. If the BBC responds in that way to a breach, then it indicates that the journalists are running the BBC. The BBC is not running the journalists.
But Trevor, it turns out that they did change the guidelines. Are you confident that Lineker is breaking the new guidelines? Because the BBC argument is that this is not a man who presents for the BBC either politics or news, and therefore that he is in a different category and he should be given much more leeway to express his political views.
Well, what I want to take issue with is the BBC's argument that somehow or other, because all he's involved in is giving commentary on football, and I don't say that lightly, I mean, it's obviously very important, but it's not news. Therefore, he's less important somehow, and therefore shouldn't have to be subjected to the same rules. That doesn't make any logical sense, because the reason he is perhaps one of the most influential people within the BBC, he has 10 million, close to 10 million followers on Twitter. He's approaching 10 million, I think. There will be very few people at the BBC that can boast that. And why is that? Because he followed his very successful career as a footballer with many years as the main presenter on the BBC of their main football programme, which is, of course, the biggest sport in the world. So he's been catapulted to importance by the BBC, and therefore his reputation is very much bound up with the BBC's, and it doesn't really make sense to therefore loosen their guidelines for their most influential people.
On the other hand, I'm slightly struck by the fact that, as I understand it, the audience for Match of the Day is around 2 million across the course of the programme. 2 million doesn't sound like an enormous number to me. I made a commercial when I was 8 years old, which was shown in the middle of Coronation Street. My first audience at the age of 8 was 15 million.
Well, that obviously says a lot about yourself as compared with Gary Lineker. But I still think that the real point is that don't look at the number of people watching the BBC so much as the number of people watching Gary Lineker. And 9 million followers is unquestionably a strong influencer by almost anybody's standards. And that's really why what he does and what he says is a reflection on an iconic figure within the BBC. He is very well known, for instance, for being paid more than anybody else in the BBC, and that's government money, effectively. And he's paid 8 times what the country thinks it's worth paying the Prime Minister. Gary Lineker's paid 8 times that. Because of his iconic position on the BBC. So to suggest that somehow the rules on impartiality should be relaxed for a person of that level of influence, to my mind, makes no sense whatsoever.
Thank you very much indeed, Trevor Asserson. Joining me now to discuss this further is a former BBC executive, Roger Bolton, who's going to share his thoughts on the Gary Lineker conundrum. Roger, very good to speak to you. Welcome to BBC News. I hope you may have had the chance... welcome to GB News. I hope you may have had the chance of hearing that interview just then. I wonder what you think the Gary Lineker debacle, if I can call it that, tells us about the direction of the BBC and the control of its management.
Well, can I tell you what I thought about that interview from the gentleman in Israel? I mean, it was ludicrous. Large sections of it were ludicrous. I'm not employed by the BBC. I've been highly critical of them. I run a podcast which is quite examines what they say. But to suggest the BBC has abandoned impartiality is entirely wrong. Now, they may not be sufficiently good at it, but to suggest they've abandoned it is ridiculous. They work hard at it, but it's such a difficult concept. And it's quite right that the new chair, if he's confirmed, and others, should focus on this. It's vital to the BBC's reputation. It's also true BBC gets it wrong occasionally. But to suggest they're abandoning it is absolutely crackers. And then when you look at the description he put forward of the guidelines on impartiality, I mean, he doesn't recognise there's a real issue here. There's something you do obviously believe in, which is freedom of speech on the one hand, against the responsibility to be impartial because you are a broadcaster which gets money from the licence fee, not, by the way, government money, which again was said before. So, there are two areas of this. Anybody working for news and current affairs, no, you don't tweet, you don't say anything, you don't sign letters, whatever. On the other hand, people like you who've done great railway journalism, whatever, it'd be ludicrous to say to you that because you work for the BBC and doing such programmes, you shouldn't be able to say what you think. And then you get this middle ground of people, actually freelancers, Gary Lineker works for other people, but who are seen to present very important programmes. That's where the guidelines get difficult. And my reading of the situation is that Gary Lineker, in signing the letter he did not break the guidelines. But in the tweets that followed, he did break them. Now, big question is, what do you do? The last time the BBC tried to discipline him, give him a yellow card on this, large number of his supporters refused to take his place and refused to appear in programmes. My own view is that, yes, he's broken them. He should actually, the BBC and Gary Lineker should come to a parting of ways. Sadly, he's a good guy. He believes in what he's saying, but he shouldn't do this. And he's putting the BBC into a difficult position time and time again. But to say that there aren't people at the BBC who are committed to impartiality and are genuinely agonising with this issue is crazy.
In defence of Trevor, what I heard Trevor say, amongst other things, certainly, was that Gary Lineker had been provided with his platform because of all the fame that has come to him from being a BBC employee. And therefore, I think Trevor's argument was, you can't just simply say that because he's not presenting politics or the news, he's free to say whatever he wants. He's saying whatever he wants on the basis that he has achieved that fame thanks to the BBC. Was there something in that point?
Not a lot. He achieved his fame because he was a brilliant centre-forward and scored a large number of goals for England. He's also a very good presenter who's worked elsewhere. But of course, yes, it does help him and his prominence that he presents Match of the Day, or he's a successful businessman in other ways. No, I mean, the BBC doesn't say you can say what you like. It's trying to draw guidelines, and between this sort of two icebergs, really, or Scylla and Charybdis, if you like, between, on the one hand, freedom of expression and the right of people like you, and as I've made the point about you appearing, say what they like, and the need for the BBC to be impartial and to be seen as impartial, particularly in its news and current affairs input. In this middle ground, it's difficult. My view is that Gary Lineker is putting himself first before the BBC, and it would be very helpful now if he shut up. And if he won't shut up, I think there should be a parting of the ways. I actually think that probably next season, Match of the Day will not be presented by Gary Lineker. But by the way, what you mentioned about the drop in audiences, that's a reflection of what is happening generally in the industry, where very few programmes outside the Queen's funeral or the coronation or Strictly Come Dancing will ever get into sort of 12 million or something like that. People are watching offline, and this is, again, this mammoth problem for the BBC to deal with.
Roger Bolton, thank you very much. A very nuanced view there on the Gary Lineker situation.